My name is Bruce Antkowiak. I am the chairman of the criminology department here at St. Vincent College. On behalf of our chancellor, Archabbot Douglas, our president, Brother Norman, and we are honored to have Bishop Malesic here as well, I welcome you to this public forum on the opioid crisis that is facing our region. A little over 2 years ago, my friend and colleague, Dr. Eric Koshin, approached me with a deep concern. A number of law enforcement officers he knew here in Westmoreland County related that they had never seen a drug plague as dangerous, pervasive, or deadly as the heroin epidemic that this area was experiencing. It was clear to them and clear to Dr. Koshin that a concentrated effort to battle that plague was needed, but that law enforcement efforts alone would not be enough. What they needed was insight about the causes of the addiction cycle and effective treatment methods for addiction sufferers and their families. In coming to Dr. Koshin with this concern, those law enforcement officers came to someone who has given his life to public service. Eric Koshin was a United States Marine, or as he would put it, is a United States Marine to this day. He decided to forego a career as a special agent for the FBI so that he could become a teacher and use his academic skill to inspire a new generation of public servants and to direct his own research to causes serving the greater good of his community. Dr. Koshin asked me to give him the go-ahead to launch a study of the addiction crisis in this area using our own students as his research team. His purpose was not to fill the pages of some academic journal, but to help policymakers find the best way to channel resources to combat this plague. And for the next 2 years, he would selflessly direct his own efforts to this study, refining it ultimately with the help of his PhD dissertation director, Dr. John Lewis of IUP, a man who is not only highly respected in the criminology community, but a man of such a good heart that he readily agreed to lend his expertise to this effort. It was only in the later stages of this effort that a very generous donor was able to provide some funds to aid this research. I had the easiest part of all. All I had to say was, yes, go do it. That yes was so easy for me because what Dr. Koshin and his team is trying to do in this ongoing effort represents the best of what the criminology department and all of St. Vincent College stands for. It is an effort firmly within the legacy of the Benedictine tradition, which seeks to bring the full range of insights the liberal arts can give us to a deeply human problem that the teachings of Catholic social justice require us to address. It is an effort to give all who are touched by this work, the addiction sufferers, their families, the researchers, and all of us who can learn from this work, an example of the best way to find a better and more meaningful life. It is with great pleasure and my great honor to introduce to you Dr. John Lewis of Indiana University of Pennsylvania and Dr. Eric Koshin of the St. Vincent College Criminology Department.
I believe I speak for Dr. Lewis when I say how grateful we are for the opportunity to share our findings with the members of the St. Vincent community and our neighbors in and outside of Westmoreland County. Bruce Antkowiak commented that he had the easiest part of this effort, but the truth of the matter is that this turnout and the news about our work would not have reached the number of people it did without his diligent and persistent work. From the very beginning of this research endeavor, Bruce has been a stable and constant source of support and encouragement. Our students enrolled in both the undergraduate and master's criminology programs here at St. Vincent College, as well as Dr. Sarah Daly, my colleague in the criminology department, who helped put this PowerPoint together, and I all know how blessed we are to have such a strong leader with the deep insight that you have on a variety of topics and issues. I tell my students that in a world where people were playing checkers, Bruce Ankowiak is playing chess. We thank you for all that you do on behalf of the Criminology Department and the people who make it what it is, Bruce. This is Dr. John Lewis. John is a full professor in the Criminology and Criminal Justice Department at the Indiana University of Pennsylvania. And we first met on the very first night of our graduate school when we were both enrolled in the master's program at IUP. I had come straight from my undergraduate work at the University of Pittsburgh at Greensburg, and John had just finished serving honorably for 23 years in the United States Army. John achieved the rank of first sergeant and was part of a military police unit, serving multiple tours overseas and stateside. John progressed through his doctoral work at a lightning pace, and I have the distinct honor of being the first person to have John chair his dissertation. John is an incredible statistician and researcher, but more importantly for me, he is a trusted friend and someone whom I admire and respect for his unselfish willingness to always give of his time and talent to help a friend and colleague in need. John is passionate about seeking the truth on matters such as this and truly allows the research to guide him. He is an example to all of what scholarship and integrity are all about. We would not be here this evening without this man who spent countless hours sifting through a monstrous data set with me for the better part of 4 or 5 months. So allow us to begin and know that we will be happy to answer questions after we conclude with our initial findings, and I thank you for being here this evening. I do not have to tell you how bad the opioid epidemic is, especially in this part of the country. According to the Center for Disease Control, since 1990, drug overdose deaths in the nation have tripled. Here in Pennsylvania, the overdose crisis has reached epidemic proportions. And in Westmoreland County, drug overdoses have increased by over 300% since 2002. Overdoses, both from prescription and illegal drugs, have been the leading cause of death in Westmoreland County 7 of the last 8 years. Record numbers of overdose deaths occurred during the past 4 years, with 2016 being the deadliest thus far. Obviously, the numbers and percentages alone suggest that this is a serious public health problem that affects all citizens in one way or another. On July 28, 2014, I had a phone conversation with Westmoreland County Detective Tony Marcacci. Tony Marcacci is a friend of mine and a mentor to me who has spent his professional life dedicating his time, training, efforts, and career towards enforcing drug crimes in the state of Pennsylvania. In his decades of experience with drugs and narcotics, he relayed that fact that, in his expert opinion, heroin was the deadliest and most addictive drug he has witnessed in his lifetime. He referred to it as pure evil and suggested the addictive properties and the toll it takes on the individual, their families, and society as a whole makes the cocaine and crack epidemic of the 1980s and 90s seem minimal in comparison, with all due respect to the pains and destruction caused by those drugs during those times. The conversation between Detective Marcacci and myself came on the wake of several heroin overdose deaths earlier that summer. As we spoke, the persisting theme of something needs to change resonated between the two of us. Something needed to be done. By the end of our conversation, the idea of conducting a study, a detailed and clinical study into the lives of people who were addicted to controlled substances began to take form. We both saw the need to delve into a variety of aspects in their life, knowing full well that some very difficult questions would have to be asked in order to understand and learn more about the pathways to addiction and recovery. These ideas quickly transformed from talk into action and I began putting together a detailed survey that revolved around the questions that needed answered. After gaining approval from the powers that be at St. Vincent College, a top-notch research team was assembled. The original team included Olivia Matthews, Jada Pinnell, Samantha Harris, Christopher Winkler, Dylan Adams, Jacob Maxwell Noonan, and Marie Lotto. Those people have gone on to wonderful careers since their time at St. Vincent. So an additional 15 members of the criminology department were recruited to help code and analyze the data. Those original 7 individuals and I spent hours upon hours in the early mornings before class and in the evenings after class honing our listening and interview skills with techniques I acquired during my short time with the FBI and with other research projects I was a part of. We became more familiar with the survey, which served as our interview guide. And in time, we were ready to begin our study with the following outcomes in mind: to outline and prioritize the key pathways to addiction by our county residents. For example, what starts the addiction cycle? Is it a substance abuse problem? Is it a mental health problem? Is it a physical health issue? Does trauma and stress play a significant role in their life? What are the progression points? Number 2, identify key intercept points within those pathways to addiction where timely and appropriate interventions can be established, which provide alternate options and supports. Thanks to Tony Marcacci and Tim Phillips, Director of the Westmoreland County Drug Overdose Task Force, who gave us access to these meetings by speaking to those who attended NA meetings and various other meetings throughout the county, we began interviewing on a voluntary basis anyone we could talk to. We were well received thanks to Tim Phillips, who vouched for us with members of those meetings and reinforced the idea we were there to learn about addiction with the intent to help, not judge. Again, this study would not be possible without Tim Phillips giving us access to these people whom we needed to speak to the most. As a result, we acquired some very good, thorough, honest, and thought-provoking interviews, each one taking at least an hour to complete. After several weeks, we moved on to interviewing people at the day reporting center, many of whom were court-mandated to attend treatment meetings. All the interviews were incredibly thorough, productive, and enlightening in a number of research areas. We interviewed people, as I said, at Narcotics Anonymous meetings, the Day Reporting Center, the Westmoreland County Jail, thanks to Warden Walton, who set up space for us in his jail to conduct these interviews, methadone maintenance clinics, and we had voluntary correspondence from individuals who learned about this study, either from newspapers or from other people. We interviewed approximately 160 to 175 people at various stages of addiction and recovery. Some of those interviews were cut short due to participant not wanting to continue, their ride or transportation was leaving, or they did not want their stories shared or analyzed. As a result, our final sample was 158 people. Of the 158 people, 128 used heroin and 30 did not. The gender breakdown gave us about 2/3 of our population male and 1/3 female, with an age range of 18 to 63. Other demographics that were looked at included their race, their highest grade completed in school, their employment status, their primary source of income, their zip code of residence, any military service, who resided in their home with them currently, a diagnosis or discussion of a psychiatric or mental health disorder, the number of times arrested, and if those arrests had anything to do with drugs and or alcohol, and the outcome of said arrests, meaning jail or probation, fines or mandated treatment. From these demographics, we began transitioning into specific questions about any and all drugs experimented with and regularly used. We began by asking them if they ever used marijuana. Most people indicate they have, and from there we asked questions that tapped into important things like, at what age did you start using this drug? How often did you use this drug? Was there a progression in use with this drug? When was the last time this drug was used? What were the circumstances around using the drug? Was it at a party, to meet a girl, to meet a boy, to relieve stress, to not deal with traumatic issues throughout life? Who did they use with primarily? Was it friends? Was it family? Did they use alone? Who taught them how to use? If they stopped, what was the reason for stopping that use? We also looked at the chronological sequence of the drugs that they experimented with to see if there was a pattern, almost like a lineup in baseball. Again, we did this with every drug imaginable. Obviously, not every addict has tried every drug, but we have found that some people will try just about anything and everything. These next two slides are a drug inventory that show the percentage breakdown of the 158 people that we interviewed, beginning with PCP, the least used or abused drug in the sample. To the far right, you see the mean age or the average age of onset. To the right of that number, if you look at PCP, the average age that someone starts PCP is right around the age of 19. The parameters to the right of that number indicate the lowest age indicated and the highest age indicated. And as you look down that chart there, you see that ecstasy is the first drug listed on this slide, where more than half of the people that we interviewed participated in. The average age for ecstasy, as you can see there, is 19. Our youngest person experimented with ecstasy at the age of 9, the oldest at 30. Our next slide takes a look at the drugs that are really more pertinent to this study. And as you see, every single drug on this slide, more than half of the people that we interviewed used or abused. Alcohol, 71%. Prescription medication, 71%. Heroin, 81%, same as cocaine, and marijuana, 94.3% of the people. Again, if you look at the average age to your far right category, the two that stick out for us are alcohol at 14.28 and marijuana at 14.01. That is saying that the average age for people we interviewed for marijuana use was 14. To the far right there, you see the parameters for age. Some people started at the age of 6 for marijuana, 5 for the age of alcohol, and the oldest started marijuana at the age of 30. From there, John and I became curious about whether or not there was a difference in drug histories when comparing heroin users with non-heroin users. And as you see here, the non-heroin users are the red columns, the blue columns are for heroin users. And as you see, for the drugs, specifically cocaine, prescription, ecstasy, and LSD, we have a statistically different population here. Those drugs are statistically different in use. Alcohol was about the same. Marijuana, everybody used marijuana. Opium, not much of a difference between heroin users and non-heroin users. But there is a difference in cocaine use between heroin and non-heroin users, cocaine use between the two groups, ecstasy use between the two groups, and LSD use between the two groups. So our next question was, is there any difference between heroin and non-heroin users when looking at the age of onset for drug use? Meaning, at what age did they begin experimenting with these drugs? And was there a difference between those who moved on to heroin and those who did not? And again, as you see here, for cocaine, prescription, ecstasy, and LSD, there is a statistical difference in the age at onset for a heroin user versus a non-heroin user. Every one of the drugs, with the exception of ecstasy, was used or abused, whatever verb you choose to use, was used at an earlier age by heroin users than by non-heroin users.
So what we're going to look at now is whether one substance being abused could predict another substance. But before I do that, I would just like to thank Eric very much for inviting me down here. This is sort of out of my realm. I am a first sergeant. I'm used to screaming and hollering at people, not having people listen to me. But as a professor, I teach research methods and statistics, so anytime you feel like going to sleep during the presentation, I understand. One of the things that was important to us is at the age of 21, which is the legal drinking age in Pennsylvania and across the Commonwealth and other states, if you are following the law, what are your chances of progressing onto other drug use? So again, if you look at the slide, you can see if people were consuming alcohol under the age of 21, 96% were already using marijuana. So you can see the drugs are starting to build up. Once I get that idea that I'm going to use these, it seems like whatever's available as we go through these slides. Cocaine, 83.3%, if they used alcohol under the age of 21, went on to cocaine use. 75% prescription, 78.70% for heroin itself. So it's not, and Eric and I want to be really, really clear here, because if you all remember the 1930s, 1940s, marijuana got this idea of it is a gateway drug. What is the first drug you ever used? When we talk to a prison population, they say marijuana. Then we automatically made the jump from marijuana is your next step to a harder drug. We've since found out through a lot of research that a lot of folks, 94% of this sample have used marijuana. 94% of this sample did not use heroin. So it's a primer, and we like to use that word primer, because not everybody you see using alcohol or marijuana at a really young age has moved on to onto heroin and harder drugs. It's the younger ages that we see, and we'll see in the slides, the younger you start seeing these two drugs showing up in a student's life or a child's life, the better chance, I mean, we're talking 80, 90%. If something does not interrupt that cycle, you're going to see them using heroin by about the age of 25 or 26. So again, looking at, I was using marijuana consumed under the age of 21. 72% are using alcohol. There seems to be a little trade-off. A lot of people who used only marijuana did not use alcohol, alcohol only to marijuana. But that primer drug, be it alcohol or marijuana, started to blend together when they got into these heavier drugs. So you see 81% if you use marijuana under the age of 21, 81% are moving on to cocaine, 72.9% onto prescription, and another 81% onto heroin. Now these pathways, and we'll talk about those in a minute, right now we're hearing prescription drug leads to heroin use. There is a pathway there. But these pathways seem to be lined with different drugs. And it's not just a simple, here's prescription, here's marijuana in the 30s, 40s, now you're into heroin or cocaine or LSD, whatever. It's not as simple as here's prescription today, here's heroin 4 years from now. We have intervention points here, and if we're really smart about this and we'd like to do some more studies, we can all see those intervention points. We can identify them and we can try to prevent this. When we looked at those that use cocaine under the age of 21, again, you can see a real high marijuana use. Most of that marijuana use was before the cocaine ever happened. You see a real hard, again, heroin use. Cocaine is one of the drugs, in talking to some of the law enforcement folks, as we start trying to dry up prescription, what we're finding is a lot more cocaine arrests. We dry up one drug, another drug comes back. We try to dry up that drug through prosecution, getting distribution, whatever, another drug comes back. We've got to the point now where we're worried about carfentanil and fentanyl, people willing to put elephant tranquilizers into their body. I mean, this is how severe this epidemic is becoming, and the earlier we can interrupt the cycle, the better chance we have of lowering that fatality rate. Looking at prescription drugs were consumed under the age of 21. Again, a lot of these folks had already used alcohol, already used marijuana. You'll see a lot of them already use cocaine, and they're headed down that pathway through prescription towards heroin. And you can see the very high use compared to those who did not use heroin were very seldom found in and around these drugs. Cocaine and prescription, the key thing here, if you were taking cocaine and prescription drugs under the age of 21, 93.88% chance you're going to be taking heroin. Eric and I will go over the numbers here at the mean ages, but spoiler alert, about 4 years after you see this drug combination, you see a heroin combination. And the 128 people we had for heroin, one of the things we talked about of the 30 who had not used heroin or did not report using heroin was the fact that did we get them in the interview cycle, or did his folks and himself get those folks in a survey cycle that was within that 2 or 3 window of prescription and cocaine. So they were headed towards heroin. The survey just occurred for those 30 before they were there. So it's not to say they weren't really heroin users. They may have been headed down that pathway. When alcohol and marijuana abuse do not begin before age 18. So we're holding off on our marijuana use and we're following the Commonwealth's laws of no drinking until age 21. You can see cocaine use, 2 people. You can see prescription, nobody. You can see heroin, 1 person. These early use of drugs, as Eric was saying, age 6 for marijuana, age 5 for alcohol. These seem to be an indicator, and to steal words from Tim down here, they seem to be an indicator of a bigger problem. What we're looking at as the drugs are the problem. The drugs are the symptom of an underlying problem. And we'll talk about that when we close, of what may be those problems. When alcohol and marijuana occurs only at the age of 21, there was no abuse. So again, the earlier you see these folks on drugs, the earlier we can intervene once we see that drug use, the better it's going to be for all of us. If we roll that back, not 21, let's talk about if we start seeing this under the age of 15. I've already explained where the numbers come from. If you're seeing alcohol use at the age of 15, you're talking about 55 out of 158 participants. Out of those 55, they've already used marijuana. Or all 100 of them will go on to use marijuana. 100%. If you're starting to use alcohol before age 15, 100% of this sample went on to use marijuana. 94.5% of the sample went on to use cocaine. 80% went on to use prescription, and 81.8% went on to use heroin. So again, an early indicator of any drug abuse is just showing a pathway to a worse drug abuse and potential fatality incident. When marijuana was consumed under the age of 15, again, you can look at the numbers down across there. Intermixed in the data, whether you took alcohol first, whether you took marijuana first. When Eric talked about the averages, one was like 14.01 and one was like 14.67. And I know it's a whole bunch of numbers and only a few of us geeks really like numbers. But I know you're out there. Okay. For the cocaine itself, you're seeing that 82.35% of these people on marijuana by the age of 15 went on to cocaine, 78% went on to prescription, and 87% went on to heroin. Again, almost every one, we've seen the alcohol. It gets more mixed as we start getting into heavier drugs because it starts talk availability. Where can I get my cocaine? Where can I get my heroin? Where can I get my prescription? Where can I get my LSD? For alcohol and marijuana, the market really seems to be out there. How hard is it for anyone in a college environment to get alcohol? How hard is it for students living in and around a college environment, 16, 17, 18 years old, to talk someone getting alcohol? How many of us have alcohol in our house that is accessible? Alcohol is a really easy drug to get. Same way with marijuana. A lot of us don't understand how easy it is if you know what you're doing out there at age 10, 11, 12, 13 to get marijuana. Some states are now passing it for recreational use, which means I can bring up to 1/8 of an ounce into my house. I'm not, again, it's a primer drug. If you see young kids using it, it means there's a problem somewhere in their life. It's not the marijuana. The marijuana is the symptom of that problem. The alcohol is the symptom of that problem. We need to look at the problem and not the symptoms. When we look at alcohol and marijuana both being consumed by an individual under the age of 15, population drops down to 45 instead of 55. Again, 55 was alcohol first, then I went on to marijuana. This is 45, I'm using them both. You can see 93% are gone on to cocaine, 84 will go on to prescription, those are same folks, and 84% of those are gone on to heroin. The earlier we start seeing, the better chance we're gonna have for a long-term problem. Progression from one substance to another. When we looked at the 100 folks that in the survey said, I use both prescription and heroin, 85 went from prescription to heroin. 15 actually went from heroin to prescription. Again, it's availability. 111 people reported going from cocaine to using both cocaine and heroin. 77% of those folks said I used cocaine first, I went on to heroin. The other 23%, I used heroin first, then I went on to cocaine. When we looked at 101 people who used cocaine and prescription, they reported we used this about the same time, so we don't know exactly, nor could they recall which one was used first. You can see cocaine to prescription was 49, prescription to cocaine was 38, and prescription and cocaine were 14% going. So again, when we start seeing the lower level drugs at a younger age, we start seeing the higher level drugs at ages, and then about 22, 23, we see heroin. Just a graphic representation of age, we were talking about the 4 or 5 year to transition from cocaine up into heroin or prescription up into heroin. You can see here for prescription, the average age of people taking prescription, those 100 people, the average age was about 19, and it's good to note that a lot of these prescriptions were not ordered for these folks. Okay, the prescriptions came out of somebody's medicine cabinet. The prescriptions we're giving at a farm party, which Eric can talk about when we conclude. The prescription may not necessarily have been identified for this person based on some physical injury or some pain. The heroin to prescription, again, you're looking at age 17.3. I started heroin for those 15 people, and then about age 23, that 5 or 6 year window, I moved on to prescription. Looking at the 111 people went cocaine to heroin, 77% went the way we'd most likely predict if you didn't know anything. I started to take cocaine, at least the way we predicted. You would start at cocaine, move on to heroin. 77% did that, but 23% moved the other way. The average ages were 18.9 to 21.8 for the heroin to cocaine. And then you see again the larger window going from cocaine to heroin, and the reason that window is larger is a lot of times there were intervening drugs in there. So I may have went from cocaine to heroin, and I stopped somewhere around LSD at 21. I stopped somewhere around prescription at 21. So you see a larger window than that 4 or 5 year window we talk about, but there's usually another intervening drug in there, or a drug of availability. When we looked at extended pathways, progression through the multiple substances, this slide right here, 63 people took the pathway of starting at cocaine. Out of those, 35 went on to prescription, and 30 of those went on to heroin. And you can see the ages right there. That's not to mean I'm still not taking marijuana, I'm still not drinking alcohol, because we looked at age of onset. So there are other drugs occurring simultaneously. Talking to some of the medical examiners, talking to the coroners, when we're doing autopsies, we're finding 4 and 5 drugs. It's not just heroin, it's not just cocaine. There are multiple drugs in that system. So it's not to say, here is what I'm on at this time, because if I can't find A, I'm going to search for B, and I'm running in a group where that is accessible. I may not be able to get whatever I want, but someone in my group is going to know where I can get something that I can substitute till I get back to my drug of choice. When we look down at prescription, out of those 63, 16 took this pathway. They started prescription at about age 16, age 17. Again, that may not have been a prescription drug identified for them. A lot of the students that you talk to now, a lot of the people that are looking at these farm parties are talking about it's prescribed drugs. It's got to be safe. The problem is that drug is not prescribed for you. We tell parents, Pennsylvania State Police do a lot of background checks. We do a lot of drug history checks. If you've got Tylenol with codeine because you get migraines, and someone comes up and explains to you exactly the kind of headache they have, and you tell them, you know what, you've got a migraine, but I've got Tylenol with codeine. Here, take one of these. You have just become a drug dealer, and that person has become a drug abuser. That drug is not prescribed for you. You're not supposed to be handing out your medication to people. And a lot of times the younger generation are thinking about, this is a prescription drug out of my mother or father's cabinet. It can't be bad for me because the doctor gave it to her or the doctor gave it to him, and I like the way it makes me feel. We've got to be real careful about that because we do see the prescription at a young age going on to cocaine and then on to heroin. 12 of the people out of those 63 sort of took, again, cocaine and heroin on the same, or cocaine and prescription on the same year. They couldn't tell you really which one came first, but they did know I took it when I was this old. So you can see that out of those 12 people, 10 went on to use heroin. So out of the 63 people, you can see that 54% went on to using heroin, based on whichever pathway they took, with other drugs in and throughout that pathway.
One of the earlier slides showed you that cocaine, prescription, and LSD, when looking at age of onset or even drug use, popped up as being significant. Ecstasy popped up as well, but when we looked through the surveys, it was more of a party drug, and it really didn't fit into the pathway model. So as we were thinking about how to predict or what were the odds of someone moving from cocaine or prescription or LSD onto heroin, John and I put together what we call a CLP score, meaning a cocaine, LSD, and prescription score. So when we talk about a CLP score, we basically look at whether or not you use cocaine and or LSD and or prescription. 18 people had a CLP score of 0, meaning 18 people never used cocaine or LSD or prescription of any kind. Of those 18, 9 went on to heroin, 9 did not. So a CLP score of 0 does not tell us anything about the odds of using heroin because you can see it's a 50-50 breakdown. If they had a CLP score of 1, meaning they used either cocaine or they used LSD or they used prescription medication, we had 28 people that used only one of those 3 drugs. Of those 28 people, 18 went on to use heroin, 10 did not go on to use heroin. When we look at our statistical analyses, we realize that there is an 80% increase in the odds of using heroin if any one of those 3 drugs listed were used. So if you use prescription, you had an 80% increase in your odds of moving to heroin. If you use cocaine only, 80% increase. LSD only, 80% increase. But what if you used 2 of those 3 drugs? What if your CLP score was 2? 59 people had a CLP score of 2, meaning they used any combination of those 3 drugs. Of the 59 people that had a CLP score of 2, 52 went on to use heroin, 7 did not. When we look at our statistical analyses, there is a 643% increase in the odds of you moving on to heroin if you used any combination of 2 of the 3 drugs listed. But what if they used all 3? What if this culture of drug use or drug experimentation, which Dr. Lewis talked about, what if they used all 3? What are the odds of them moving on to heroin? there is a 1,125% increase in the odds of using heroin if you used all three drugs, cocaine and LSD and prescription. Those odds are staggering when you look at the pathway. And yet what we're doing right now as a nation is we're looking at exclusively prescription to heroin use and abuse. And we hear numbers like 80% of heroin users come from prescription medication. Our numbers show the same thing. Right around 70 to 80% of the people went from prescription to heroin. However, there are intervening drugs that are happening in their lives that no one's looking at. And we like to use the metaphor of almost like a baseball lineup. And you know, for baseball, the catcher is usually in the 8th spot in the order, and the pitcher is usually in the 9th spot in the order. Well, just imagine prescription medication being the catcher and heroin being the pitcher. And if you're really looking to keep runs off the board, to win the game, instead of focusing only on the 8th and 9th batter in the order, we should be looking at the top of the order. What's happening early on in this lineup? And if we're giving free passes for alcohol or marijuana, and we're basically walking the top of the order, those runs are going to come around and score and harm us in the end. And again, our focus right now as a nation is exclusively on the jump from prescription to heroin. And as you've seen so far, there's a lot of other things that are taking place that we should be taking a huge step back and looking at the individual earlier in his or her life to see what's going on to try to keep some of those runs off the board and that order progressing. Some of the factors that we looked at that did not come up as being significant were things like stress. We asked participants, on a scale of 1 to 10, what is your stress score in the past year? Again, there is no statistical difference between high stress scores and low stress scores with regards to drug use type. And we were curious about that, but when you think about it, every one of us experiences stress. Instead of asking, are you under stress? The question that we should be asking is, how are you coping with that stress? Are you self-medicating? Are you trying to escape reality? Are you praying? Are you taking a nature walk? Are you going to the gym? Are you going to the range? Are you exercising? What are you doing with the stress that you have in your life? How are you coping with it? How are you handling it? We see that the people that are self-medicating are moving on to more serious drugs because, in my estimation, there is a lack of coping skills. Whether it's not being taught at home, whether it's not being taught in schools, these individuals do not have the coping skills to deal with the stressors that each and every one of us deal with on a daily basis in our lives. Instead of self-medicating, we probably need to promote more positive strategies. We looked at treatment options. We asked individuals, much like we did with the drug history and drug background, we asked them about treatment options they may or may not have experienced over the course of their life in and out of the county. We asked about detox, methadone maintenance, Suboxone, Vivitrol, therapeutic communities. We asked about every single type of rehabilitation or treatment option we could think of. We asked them how long they were involved in it. Why did they seek that? Was it self-sought? Was it court-mandated? What was the reason for seeking treatment? How long were you there for? How effective was it for you? We looked at all these options, and we did it from the individual's point of view. From their perspective, what was working? What was not working? And why was it working, or why was it not working? As you can see, we have the percentage of people that actually went through these treatment services above the green line. So 64% of the people we interviewed went through some type of detox. 36.7% used methadone maintenance. 44% were on Suboxone. 13% were on Vivitrol. 18% were involved in some type of therapeutic community. 70% did some type of inpatient rehabilitation. And below the green line, we see how effective these 6 treatments were. We have another slide too. And as you see, things like methadone, Suboxone, are not highly valued as being effective by the people that are going through these. But when we look at things on this next slide, like outpatient, treatment in jail, NA meetings or AA meetings, clergy or spiritual, meaning did they speak to a rabbi, a priest, a minister, someone from the religious community? Were they in a halfway house or a long-term treatment facility? Take a look at clergy and spiritual in NA and AA. 28.9% of people that we spoke to a priest or a minister or someone involved with a church or religious organization in some way, shape, or form. 76% of those people said that was very effective treatment. 16% said it was somewhat effective. NA meetings, Narcotics Anonymous meetings. 73% of people said it was very effective. 12% said it was somewhat effective. I wonder if those are seen as such valuable assets in treatment and recovery, because unlike methadone maintenance or unlike Suboxone, which is a pill or another medication, I wonder if we're seeing such highly valued and appreciated treatment because we're maybe getting to the source of the problem. Maybe that priest or that minister, maybe that counselor from the NA meeting, maybe they're actually getting to the source of the problem. Maybe there's less judgment taking place. Whether we talk about all being sinners, all having faults, all trying to be better people, what have you, it seems as though the actual treatments that are more long-term in nature and that could possibly be getting to the heart and the root of the problem are deemed more effective and valuable in the lives of those people that are going through those treatments. It's something to consider as we move forward. John said, I wonder what happens with those treatment options you put up on the board there. I wonder what happens if we control for whether or not that treatment was mandated, meaning they were court mandated to go to NA, or they were court mandated to go to outpatient therapy. So we have here treatment reported as ineffective, but they were court mandated to go. So 92% of the people that received treatment in jail, that were court mandated for treatment in jail, said that that was ineffective. 85% of people that went to outpatient therapy, court mandated outpatient therapy, said it was ineffective. 73% halfway house said it was ineffective. We talked about court mandated and whether or not we're doing ourselves a great disservice because there are people in the community that would like to get into outpatient therapy or like to receive some type of treatment intervention, and maybe those seats are filled with people who are court mandated to be there. So they're kind of left out on the street on their own until a seat opens up. And again, I'm not exactly sure how we reconcile that moving forward, but if you ask me, if someone does not want to be in treatment, they're not going to change, they're not going to recover unless that is something from themselves that they absolutely positively want to see happen. So I wonder if we're doing ourselves a disservice by some of our court-mandated treatment. Because if people don't want to be there, it's no different than when we're in class and students are in class and they don't want to take notes or sit at a meeting and don't want to take notes. They're not going to put forth that effort, they're not going to pay attention, and they're going to get nothing out of that session whatsoever unless they truly want to be there. Gender, again, we had about 2/3 of our population were males, 1/3 were females. There is no difference in heroin use when we look at gender. Mental health, there is no difference in mental health diagnoses. Employment, no difference when we control for employment. When we look at education, there's a slight difference in education. Actually, the more education you have, the more time you spend in school. I don't know if this is really good for public education and college, higher education, but the longer that you spend in school, the more years you spend in college, the more likely you are to transition to more serious drugs. And again, we believe it's because that's the culture. When you're engaging in that type of behavior with other peers, without parental supervision, with lots of free time, and the drugs are more readily available, you're going to have more people experimenting with those controlled substances the longer they're in those institutions. So again, we're not condemning higher education, obviously, But it really, I think, gives credence to the idea that this is a culture problem. It's a problem with who we are surrounding ourselves with and what activities are taking place during these interactions. I have said time and again, the opposite of addiction is not necessarily sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And when we marginalize people and push them further and further and further towards the fray, I really think we're compounding the issue tremendously. And what needs to happen is they need to be surrounded with better people who are engaging in more pro-social activities, who have better coping skills, and that are really handling their stress in a more appropriate and pro-social manner than self-medication. Because as people age, and this may be one of the reasons why we see a progression from one drug to the next, as people age, in my estimation, the stress as we get older becomes more intense. You know, the worst thing in the world might be this girl didn't go to the prom with me, I didn't make the basketball team in high school, and at that time, maybe alcohol or marijuana suffices as a good escape from that stress or that problem. But as we get older and parents get sick and we don't get into schools that we want to get into and we don't have the jobs that we want to have, or we have health issues of our own, perhaps the need to delve deeper into that addiction and find a substance that takes me further out of reality, perhaps that is happening. And again, we look at the age at onset for these things and what's happening early on, because that really is a better predictor than whether or not they're on a prescription medication at the time. Lots of people have surgeries, lots of people provide prescription medication. Lots of people are not abusing heroin, but some are. So what is the root cause of that? Again, as you've heard time and again, Dr. Lewis and I, our first thoughts, and when we started this study, this was completely exploratory. We asked 20 pages back to back of questions, and as I said before, spent the better part of an hour, sometimes 2.5 hours with people learning about their history and the things in their life. We asked about traumatic events, early childhood trauma, sexual victimization, physical assault, physical abuse, emotional abuse, whether they had a life-threatening illness, if they've ever been in a life-threatening accident before. We looked at all those variables. That didn't pop up as significant. Dr. Lewis and I don't have a horse in the race. We are reporting the stats. We had no preconceived notions or ideas about what we would find. But what we did find has led us to where we are today. And our initial thoughts in moving forward really would be to focus more as we do further iterations of this study, hopefully in Allegheny County, hopefully in Indiana County, with your gracious help, hopefully in Westmoreland County again, to see if the same counties report the same type issues with regards to predictor drugs like cocaine, prescription, and LSD. This is one sample. This is one study in the wheel of science we'd like to replicate and focus more on what's going on in their lives when they're transitioning from alcohol to marijuana or from marijuana to cocaine. What's going on? Did your parents get a divorce? Did you lose one of your parents? Did you lose a job? Were you diagnosed with some type of sickness or illness? What was going on in your life? And as we move forward, we're absolutely going to focus on those drugs and the age at onset, but also the things that are happening in their life and how they're coping with those stressors in life that we all experience and that we all endure. That concludes our portion of our research for you this evening.